Good morning. I'm Alex Talk, the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership, and I'm pleased to welcome you here today for the Thompson Center's Rural Teacher Workforce Summit. I want to begin by thanking all of you for joining us. The sustainability of Wisconsin's rural community depends on the strength of its schools, and the strength of those schools depends on teachers in the classroom. It's encouraging to see so many of you here who care about that challenge. I also want to thank our researchers, Brad and Jenny, and all of our esteemed panelists. And special thanks to Ruth and Lily at the Thompson Center, without whom this event simply wouldn't be possible. For those unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me say a few words about it. The Thompson Center was established to follow in the footsteps of Governor Tommy Thompson, who proudly worked with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. In seeking to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy, the Thompson Center works to foster effective public leadership by offering public events, funding research and scholarships, and conducting other activities across the UW system. Today's conversation is a great example of the kind of work the Thompson Center is proud to support. Rural communities in Wisconsin and elsewhere in the nation are struggling to recruit and retain teachers that are essential to the success of our students, their schools, and ultimately the long-term vitality of the communities. We have a remarkable group of researchers, district leaders, and policy experts here today drawing on experience from across the upper Midwest. That gives us a real opportunity to learn what's working, what isn't, and what Wisconsin can do to meet these challenges. I'll introduce our speakers only briefly, since you'll find more complete and more impressive biographies in your program. First, our researchers. Dr. Bradley Carl, research scientist and founding co-director of the Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative at UW-Madison School of Education. And Dr. Jenny Seelig, senior research scientist with education and child development at NORC. We'll be joined by our panelists, Dr. Shireen Belstein, of WIERC, Dr. Vincent Brunig, District Administrator for the School District of Lodi, Jeff Wright, Superintendent of Sauk Prairie School District, Laura Mogelson, Director of the Multiple Pathways to Teaching Office at University of Minnesota Twin Cities, and Sarah Shaw, Deputy Research Director at the Wisconsin Policy Forum. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being a part of this. I'm really eager to learn more from all of you. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Bradley Carl to get us started. Thank you, Brad.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for the nice introduction, and thank you to the Thompson Center for their generous sponsorship of our work. Welcome to everyone who is here in person. Thank you for braving the elements. I guess we've had enough of a respite in between hailstorms over the last 48 hours for you to be here. Thank you for being here. Thank you as well for those of you who are attending in person, and happy tax day to everybody. I am, as Alex indicated, I am one of the co-directors of the Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative. It's part of the Wisconsin Center for Education Research, which is the research arm of the School of Education at UW-Madison. This topic, the educator workforce, and in particular the rural educator workforce, is one of my areas of study. I have a good group of colleagues who have helped me with a lot of this work, and owe them a big thank you. In particular, the rural educator workforce is near and dear to my heart. I grew up in a rural district up in the far northern part of the state, and so this is an issue that's important to me. So with that, I'm going to, the first part of our presentation today, Jenny and I are going to talk a little bit about, give you some results from our work, and then we'll transition to our panel, and then we'll do some questions from the audience. So I will turn it over to Jenny at this point.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon if you're on live stream and on the East Coast, but good morning otherwise. My name is Jenny Seelig, and as Alex already said, I'm a senior research scientist in education and child development at NORC, which is a planet on Star Trek. It's a nonprofit research organization affiliated with the University of Chicago. However, I am also very familiar with rural Wisconsin. So I did my PhD at education policy studies at UW-Madison, and I spent a year of that time living in the Northwoods, doing a dissertation on school community relations. And so that really launched my career in thinking about rural teacher workforce in the state of Wisconsin. However, it's also important to note that I was a high school teacher in my past life. And so I taught high school Spanish both in Baltimore City Public Schools and then also in rural Appalachian, Ohio. So a different type of rural than we have in Wisconsin, but that really spurred me to a PhD in thinking about rural education. So at NORC, I studied both the rural teacher workforce and teacher workforce in general, as well as school community relations and qualitative methods. So Brad and I have been working on these series of studies with the Thompson Center's blessing over the last several years, and we're very excited to share the information that we have learned today with you. So I want to start off too by recognizing that rural, it means the connection between people and land. And so we want to acknowledge that the land that we are on today is part of the traditional lands of the indigenous peoples, including the Potawatomi, Menominee, and Ho-Chunk. So this land, known as Dejop, is a place where the Ho-Chunk people have lived, cultivated, and honored for generations. So we pay our respects to the Ho-Chunk Nation, their elders past and present, and honor the first 12 nations of Wisconsin. We are also grateful to the Tommy Thompson Center on Public Leadership for their generous support of our research and Wisconsin's rural educator workforce. And also, we want to make sure that we thank Ruth Brash for the organization and the logistics, Alex Talk as the director of the center, and Lily Schwenk for all of the additional supports over the last couple of years. We also want to thank our research teams at WCR, so McKenna and Dan in particular, and at NORC, Claudia, Elior, Emily, and Zoe. So I do want to start off with a little bit of a teacher move. We're going to play a game. So if you brought your number 2 pencil with you, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is rural Wisconsin, and I'd love you to play along, and don't worry, it's multiple choice. So I'm hoping, I can't see the screen, but hopefully you see a picture right now that says, what do we know about rural Wisconsin? Great. So rural America is not a monolithic entity, but a diverse set of locales and people with various histories and cultures, and as I already mentioned, an attachment to land. So this is distinct from the busyness of cities and often from the congestion of highways. And so while many of us in this room live and work in Wisconsin, what do we know about rural Wisconsin? So the first question is, rural Wisconsin is a leading producer of which of the following? Cranberries, milk, snap beans, ginseng. You can shout it out loud, whisper to your partner, write it down. Ooh, I heard somebody knew the answer, and the answer is all of the above. So we have a lot of wonderful produce and agriculture in the state of Wisconsin, but it's important to recognize it isn't all just milk. And also for our Minnesota and Illinois guests here today and online, in Minnesota, the top rural agricultural products are sugar beets and turkeys. And in Illinois, it is not corn. It is pumpkins and horseradish. So now you've all learned something new today. All right, but that's not the only question. Question number 2. What % of Wisconsin school districts are rural or town by NCS definition, for those of you who are researchers in the room? Brad's going to dig more into that later. But for now, what % of Wisconsin school districts are rural or town? Hint, if you looked at the poster to my right, you would know the answer. So, your options are 12%, 40%, 55%, or 77%. I see conversation. I don't hear any answers, though. No guesses? 77. That is correct, 77%. of school districts in Wisconsin are classified as either rural or town. This is obviously a very large percentage of the schools in the state and the districts in the state, and it's very important that we are here today to talk about the teacher workforce in these schools. And I also just wanted to mention that in the pictures that you see here, to the left is Mercer School District, which is up in Iron County. Yes, woo, sorry. Phillips in the middle, which is in Price County. Lafarge, I don't remember what county Lafarge is in. Sorry, Lafarge. Lafarge School District, what was it?
Maybe Vernon.
Vernon? Vernon, thank you, Vernon County, and Mineral Point, Iowa County. Thank you very much. And so we have 4 different districts that we've had the pleasure in our travels to visit, represented here on the screen. Okay, last question. Which of these Wisconsin rural school districts has over 25% American Indian students? Lakeland Union School District, Bayfield School District, Menominee Indian School District. I have a smart audience in the room. I'm sure they're also smart online. So you are all correct. Lakeland Union has 26% according to the 24-25 state report cards, 26% American Indian students, 66% in Bayfield School District, and Menominee Indian at 88%. So thank you very much for playing. I hope you are now engaged in our topic and we have a shared understanding of some of the knowledge around rural Wisconsin. So I'm going to now turn it over to Brad to orient us to the rural educator workforce.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. The next part here of this our discussion will be, I'm going to go through, present a few statistics, some things that'll sort of help set the stage contextually for some of the challenges that are facing rural districts across Wisconsin in terms of the educator workforce, just to basically provide, again, some context. So let's start with, what do we mean when we say rural schools? There is no standard set definition that is probably better than what NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, uses. What they have done is developed locale codes, and so every school and every school district in the country is assigned into one of 4 locale codes. You can think of these as large grain-sized buckets that you see up on your screen: city schools, suburban, town, and rural. And then within each of the buckets, there are some subcategories. And within the town and the rural categories, the subtypes are fringe and distant and remote. And these are determined primarily by the distance from an urbanized area, which NCES defines as population of 50,000 or more. So why do these matter for our work? First of all, they give us a way of defining in a consistent way what a rural school is. So the way we've operationalized this in our work is all of the schools and the districts that are in either the town or the rural categories, we are treating those as rural. Town districts, Jeff's the superintendent of a town district. They're substantively very similar in terms of lots of the dynamics to rural districts. Other than, again, they're generally a little bit larger in size in terms of student population. We'll show you that in a minute. But we're just, again, now setting the stage for how we've operationalized rural. The other reason that this is important to look at here is the subtypes matter. And one of the things that's been very clear from our work is that not all rural and town districts are created equal or are facing similar sets of challenges. A lot of the challenges are dictated to at least some degree by their proximity to educator prep programs. Not all educator prep programs are located in urban areas, of course, but they tend to be concentrated there. So this provides us with a good way of thinking about, of defining rurality, as well as emphasizing this theme that rural districts are facing different kinds of challenges that are often related to their proximity to educator prep programs. Okay. All right, so here you're looking at one of our nice color-coded maps. Again, shout out to my colleague Dan Marlin, who's our map wizard, who does a nice job making maps on very short notice. What you're looking at here is a map of all the school districts in Wisconsin, and these are color-coded by the 4 large green buckets. So it's city and suburban and town and rural. And so what you're drawn to here, you see a lot of green on this map, right? And so the light green are the rural districts, the dark green are the town districts, the gray are suburban, and the blue are suburban, and the gray are city districts. So again, what do you see with your first Rorschach inkblot look at this? We are a heavily rural state in terms of the geography of how education is organized. So you can see, we'll show you here, you heard this statistic from one of Jenny's slides, 77% of the districts in the state are either rural or town. So more than 3/4 of districts are fitting into this definition that we've used. Okay, so let me highlight a couple following up on that bit of context, let me highlight a couple of trends that are important in informing some of the challenges facing the rural educator workforce. Here is dynamic number one, and it is declining enrollment. And declining enrollment, of course, is not a rural-specific problem. Enrollment has declined in Wisconsin across the state. There has been a 7% enrollment decline over the past 20 years. This has been particularly the numbers going down particularly after COVID, before and during and after COVID. Another way of thinking about this is looking at the percentage of districts that fit into each of the buckets. What percentage of school districts in each of the buckets are experiencing declining enrollment over the last about 10 years? And almost all of the city districts are, less than half of suburban districts, and about 2/3, 3/4 of town and rural districts are in a declining enrollment status. So what is contributing? There's a lot of factors that contribute to declining enrollment. Some of this is demographics. There's lower birth rates. There's an aging population. What this results in, again, is that most areas of the state, the rural areas of the state, are best case scenario, you're holding steady. For a lot of districts, they're in declining enrollment status. And this matters in a lot of ways. This clearly matters financially. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. Okay, let me follow up on a previous slide and say, put rural and town districts in context within the whole state. And we've showed you already that 77% of the districts in the state are rural. Rural and town districts employ half of the state's teachers and enroll about 40% of the state's student population. Now, why is that those last two numbers? Why are those numbers a little different? Why is there a higher concentration of teachers in rural schools compared to student enrollment? That's because in general they're smaller. And we're showing you on the bottom half of this slide, this is the average enrollment of districts in each of the buckets, the four main buckets. So you can see the city districts, there are not a lot of those. That includes MPS, of course. So the average enrollment across those districts is a little over 14,000. Suburban districts are down to about 3,200 average enrollment. And then you can see town and rural much smaller. So how does this matter? It matters in a lot of ways as relates to school financing. Clearly, there's some good things about smaller enrollment, right? There's smaller class size, there's greater sense of community, things like that. But clearly, this creates some financial challenges as well. There's less opportunity for what we might call economies of scale. You have to have, if you have 12 third graders, you have to teach 12 third graders, as opposed to if you have a classroom in another district of 25. You have to teach your third graders. There's higher transportation costs, right? Rural districts tend to be larger geographically, and so there's higher costs associated with transportation. I don't envy districts that budgeted for gas at whatever you budgeted at the beginning of the year, and suddenly that's probably not looking exactly right. So transportation costs are definitely a higher share of rural districts' budgets.
Brad, you're going to want to speed up a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, so let me show you then declining teacher counts. You can see on this slide here, there are the four locale types across the side. On the column called change, second column in from the right, and the percentage change, what you see here is that teacher counts are going up, have gone up over I'm showing you 3 points in time. Teacher counts have gone up over time, except in town and rural districts. Losing teachers in town and rural districts. Almost 1,000 teachers fewer in about 3% of decline for rural and town districts. And then if you drill further, again, returning to this theme of not all rural districts are in the same position, what you see here, interestingly, are the fringe districts in town fringe and rural fringe. Those are the ones that are located closer to urbanized areas. There are modest increases in teachers in fringe districts. Where are the counts going down? Further you are from urbanized areas. So counts of students, counts of teachers going down in the distant and the remote districts. And then I'll show you this one as well. There's been an interesting transformation, nothing sudden. This is gradually happening over time. If we look at the composition of teachers in terms of race, ethnicity, teachers compared to students, what you're looking at here is at 3 points in time, what is the percentage of white teachers and white students in the state overall and in rural and town districts. So what you see here is that rural teachers have remained overwhelmingly white over the last 20 years. That has budged very little. But what you see in the composition of students in rural districts, that's changed quite a bit, right? So there is now, 20 years ago, there were about 92% of the students in rural districts were white, and now that number is down 10 percentage points just in 20 years. So we'll return to this theme in terms of this reinforces the importance of developing strategies for rural districts, not just to meet staffing needs, but to diversify in a way that matches the increasing diversity of rural students. Okay, here's a map of, we're continuing on this theme of proximity. What you're looking at here is a map of districts. We color-coded this one a little differently. Blue are the rural districts. And so what you see, the colors of the pins there are the state's educator prep programs and the tech colleges. And so the dark-colored pins, the black-colored pins are the state. There are 43 approved educator prep programs. And what do you notice about the relationship of rural districts to prep programs here? Rural districts, not all of them, but rural districts tend to be located, there are big pockets of the state up in the northern and western part of the state, west central, southwest part of the state that are further from prep programs, right? And one of the things that we've learned a lot about and heard a lot about in our work is how does this matter in terms of access to student teachers, which is a key part of the pipeline to build the educator workforce. So we will return to this theme throughout our talk today. Here's just we calculated some distances, the average distance to the nearest prep program by subtype of school district. So what you can see here, this is increasing in a fairly linear way. City districts are located very close to a prep program, and by the time you make your way out to rural remote districts, those are almost 35 miles from the nearest prep program on average. Okay, last slide before I turn it back over to Jenny. One of the things we did here, one of the other ways I want to show an example of why does location matter. We did a survey of rural superintendents with the assistance of WRSA, the state's Wisconsin Rural Schools Alliance. Kudos to them. Thank you to Jeff Eide, who could not be with us. WRSA's been a big supporter of our work. What this is showing you here is we asked superintendents to rank the educator shortage, the severity of the educator shortage on a 1 to 5 scale. 1 was the least severe, 5 was the most severe. And so what we're showing you here, take a look on, keep in mind the number of districts that were responding. We didn't have a lot of town districts, town remote districts respond, but we did have a 75% response rate, which among superintendents is remarkable. We were super happy with that. No offense, superintendents have a lot on your plate, Jeff. But what can you see here? You can see the perception of the severity of the shortage is directly related to the distance from prep programs. So the remote districts, the superintendents are saying, we're having a bigger challenge here. And you can see that reflected both in the mean rating as well as what percentage ranked the shortage either a 4 or a 5 being more severe. Okay, so at this point I'm going to turn it back over to Jenny. She will take us through our first topic, which is grow your own programs.
Thanks, Brad. We did this so we could all drink some water in between. So speaking of that, I left my water.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. All right, so moving on here. So despite those challenges that Brad just laid out, we also discovered some innovative programs and strategies addressing the rural teacher shortage. So first, rural districts are not waiting around for someone else to solve their problems. They're being creative and they're being resourceful. We're going to hear some of that today. And they know their communities and their students' needs and what will attract teachers to working with them. Yet, reliable data on teacher vacancies, teacher recruitment, and teacher retention are disconnected or somewhat non-existent. And so how can districts invest in the right solutions without reliable data upon which to make their decisions? So furthermore, We have spoken to rural high school students and rural college students, and also college students who are pursuing teaching as a career. And these students are savvy, and they rely on cost-efficient practices, such as dual credit opportunities, to help them offset the cost of college, and even with the knowledge of knowing that teaching isn't the most lucrative industry, they're thinking ahead as to how to save money as they're pursuing their degrees. Also, educator prep programs, or EPPs, are committed to training future high-quality teachers for all schools. And many of these programs that we spoke with around the state believe that they're rural serving by the nature of their students coming from rural places. These EPPs want to be responsive to rural districts, and many are making inroads. Yet limited resources, capacity, and data make the best intentions hard to sustain, and others that barely scratch the surface. So finally, partnerships between higher ed and rural districts are essential, and they can be incentivized at the individual level for future teachers and at the institutional level for ensuring collaboration. So where do we go from here? How do we cultivate a sustainable cohort of high quality and committed rural teachers? In this next section, Brad and I are going to dig deeper into sort of two promising categories that have bubbled up over the years of our research. So the first is grow your own teacher programs, which I'll talk about, and the second is what we're going to call paid pre-service teaching opportunities. So first, what are grow your own teacher programs? This is probably a familiar term to many of you listening today, but grow your own is a teacher recruitment and preparation strategy that's focused on developing and retaining teachers from a local community by leading to, as Brad already mentioned, the diversification of teachers, by incentivizing the growth of teachers who have backgrounds similar to those students. Grow Your Own is also often used to address teacher shortages and strengthen the teacher workforce. So it relies on local community pathways and reciprocal relationships between institutions of higher ed, community organizations, and local districts. So Brad and I also had the opportunity to work on a research agenda in Grow Your Own. If you're interested in finding out what that looks like, that's on the New America website. It's also linked here. But there are certain features of Grow Your Own programs that we know contribute to their effectiveness. So the first here, as I've already mentioned, are strong partnerships. Partnerships between EPPs and school districts, and community organizations. The second component are structured pathways. So these are pathways that help participants earn teaching credentials and certification, and that are a clear sort of process from entering the program to becoming teachers. A third component are community-based recruitment strategies, which are used to increase the retention of the teacher workforce. There is some research that indicates that if a teacher is from a local community, and in our cases, a rural teacher from a rural community is more likely to be retained as a teacher in that community than if they were not already from that community. So the familiarity with rurality comes into play. A fourth mechanism of GYOs that leads towards effectiveness is preparation support. So this is to help participants complete their programs and earn teaching credentials. And we also call out financial support specifically. So this is to increase access to teacher preparation programs, so offsetting the cost of college. And then we also note wraparound supports through the recruitment preparation and induction years. So this could be support with childcare. It could be support that is offsetting the need to work full-time, and other initiatives. Travel, actually, that's a big one for rural districts. So if you can help offset the cost of gas for somebody who is deciding to do their student teaching in rural district, we'll talk more about that as well. And then finally, paid work-based experience. So under the guidance of an effective mentor, this is different than the current prevalent model, which is an unpaid student teaching semester. So I'm going to go through a couple of different examples, and something that I want you to take away as I go through these is that independently, these are not really grow your own programs. What we've learned in the state of Wisconsin is that we don't have a particular one program that is statewide that is going to hit all 7 of those points. What we can talk about after doing all of our research is that there are several promising programs that address a handful of these topics. And what we would like to articulate is that having all of them together under a nice cohesive umbrella that would be fluid and that would have like context and relationships and partnerships across these components, then we're moving into a new direction for the state. And so that's something that we hope to talk about with the panel. So Educators Rising, however, is a club-based grow-your-own model that offers pre-college students the opportunity to seriously consider teaching as a career path. So this is a national model from Phi Delta Kappa, but Wisconsin's local version is organized through the Wisconsin Education Association Council, or WEAC, and it's operated at the district level. So in recent years, there's been an immense growth and popularity of Educators Rising in rural districts, in part due to the flexibility of this club-based program and the ability to connect it to transcripted courses in family and consumer science, like child development, and also dual credit courses like Introduction to Education, which then transfers to four-year institutions. There's also an annual summit at UW-Stevens Point that draws students from around the state to compete in education-related tasks, develop leadership skills, and mingle with like-minded students. So this is not a rural-specific program, but a lot of rural districts have taken this up, and there's a large rural percentage population participating. So one student that we talked to, I think, makes an excellent point here about the benefits of being part of Educators Rising. They say that the one thing I definitely like is being with people who want to be in the same field as you. You feel kind of accepted in what you want to do and not as judged for the career choices you want to make. Additionally, Educators Rising is typically run through the district by a teacher. And we all know that rural teachers are often wearing many hats and have adopted many roles. And this can be a little bit tricky sometimes. So a unique model that we came across to address this challenge is a consortium of rural districts with Educators Rising clubs coordinated by CISA 10. So to my first point a couple slides ago, rural districts are being innovative, and the partners that they have in CISAs, in universities, in community colleges are also being creative to solve this problem. So there are many ways to host an Educators Rising club. So again, I want to talk about another WEAC program, actually. This is supported by WEAC. And again, it's not independently a grow your own program. But something in the research just broadly, and then also in rural teacher workforce, it's really important to understand that if you have a high school interest program and then the students go to college, there's like this black box of what happens in college, and then out the other end they become teachers. And so we really need to understand a little bit more of what supports are in place to keep those interested high school students committed to teaching while they're in college. It's also, anecdotal and true that the college students change their major on average 3 to 4 times. So how do we have them change their majors and then change it back to education, right? And so aspiring educators, we think, is an interesting sort of add-on to Educators Rising. It's a really nice sort of continuation. Once they get to college, different campuses, public and private around the state, have this student-run club. And so this is a college club for future teachers. In teacher workforce, I already said all that. So I think it's really important here to recognize that the students themselves who are in these clubs also, again, understand the value of what they're getting by being in this club. So we did a survey of 124 aspiring educator college students across 11 of these clubs just this fall. And we have some statistics here about how they feel about their participation in the program. 95% of those students agreed that it helps them discuss career interests with like-minded peers. So this is a continuation of that quote I just read from Educators Rising, right? These students see that the camaraderie and the peer-based, relationships are really important to strengthening their commitment to teaching and to pursuing that outside of college or after college. 94% agreed that it helps them understand the teaching profession. So this is huge, right? Like what does it look behind the curtain as a teacher? And so this is really important aspect that aspiring educators provides them. And then 71% said it informs decisions about where to complete student teaching. This is, in terms of rural workforce, really important. So if there's an opportunity to talk about rural teaching to these students and they're talking to each other about where they would like to do their student teaching, then this is one way, potentially, to have more people interested in teaching in rural schools. Of course, programs like Educators Rising and Aspiring Educators, they can generate interest, they can develop community, they can, think about how we build rural community-based. But what can districts do to provide them a position once they graduate? When you have a small district, it can be difficult to predict if you'll be able to hire your newly minted elementary teacher or ag teacher. In rural districts, this we call an economy of scale issue. So one example of an innovative solution is this collaboration called GROW, GROW Consortium, which is among 4 rural districts in rural Wisconsin. And so we're going to hear more from one of the superintendents later about this particular program. But it's really interesting because it provides financial support to college students and student teachers to pursue their teaching degree and to teach in one of the 4 partner districts after graduation. So to get beyond that economies of scale, they're collaborating to say, okay, so out of your high school, we have a student who pursued ag teaching, and across all of our high schools, we have one of our high schools needs an ag teacher. So that student can receive the financial benefits and come back and teach in a partner school, not the school that they necessarily graduated from. So this really blows up the problem and is really an innovative and flexible solution. So they also offer dual credit options with UW-Whitewater, I believe, teaching assistant internships for high school students that earn credit. So we'll talk more about all of these pieces later. And then the student teaching scholarship is $10,000 with a 3-year commitment to the district upon hire. So the principal of, well, she's no longer the principal. Where is Liz now?
Cambridge.
She's at Cambridge. But she, at this time, was the principal of Wisconsin Heights Middle School and High School, and also the program coordinator. And so she talks here on this quote about the purpose. She says, what we do as a group is we try to anticipate where we are going to have openings at each district that we can project. And then who do we have for candidates, and is there a match? And can we make sure that we are awarding the money to people that could potentially be employers of ours? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brad to talk about paid opportunities or paid pre-service teaching opportunity.
All right, thank you. So continuing on the theme of innovative strategies that we've learned about in our work. So we heard a little bit about grow your own programs. I want to focus on a second bucket of strategies that we're calling paid pre-service teaching opportunities. And again, this emerged from our work. It's consistent with what you read a lot about in the national research. Jenny pointed out K-12 education has long been somewhat distinct and unique in that we set up entry into the profession by requiring an extended, it's typically for a semester, student teaching. You're not paid for that, you're paying tuition, and you're entering a lower paying profession. So you connect the dots here and you think, it's not hard to imagine how there are some financial barriers on the front end that we may want to think about. And so what we focused on in our current work is 2 state-supported strategies here in Wisconsin that are working to address this issue of providing paid pre-service teaching opportunities. I'm going to skip through this one in the interest of time and show you the first program that we're focused on. It's called the Rural School Teacher Talent Grant. I have taken the liberty of abbreviating that to RTTG. This program was launched for the first time in the 2017-18 school year. It is funded through a $1.5 million legislative appropriation each year. CISA 8 is the fiscal agent for this program. This is an explicitly rural-facing program in that you have to be, in order to get this stipend to do student teaching. So what's it designed to do? It's designed to provide an incentive to encourage student teaching placements in rural districts. And so the stipend amount depends on how many people apply. In past years, it's been as low as $2,800. Sometimes it's been as high as $3,500. But again, the point here is this is an intentionally, explicitly rural-facing program. So you're only eligible for this if you teach in do a student teaching placement in a rural school. Town schools are not eligible. I want to raise that, put that on the table here in a minute as something to think about. So what can this be used for? There really aren't strings attached. Typically, students have used this for things like helping to defray the cost of transportation, to drive to a student teaching placement. Sometimes they will rent an apartment in a rural community if they want to be further than driving distance. One key feature of this program, though, is this is paid out after the semester is over. So you have to front the costs up front, and then you, as a student teacher, and then you get that back later on. So we have done a little bit of looking into what does this program look like in terms of participation trends. And so a couple of just basic descriptive statistics here. There have been, since the program was launched, there has been about 3,500 total stipends awarded since the program launched. 25 different educator prep programs total have participated. 24 of those are in Wisconsin. Winona State in Minnesota is also a participant in the program. We have this interesting dynamic with some of our prep programs and the reciprocity, right? So Winona State participates because they have a lot of students from Wisconsin. Shout out to UW Eau Claire. They are the biggest user of, the biggest advocate of this program from the standpoint of, I think that, yeah, the range, there are some prep programs that have hosted a single stipend participant. UW Eau Claire is 927 over time. That's more than 25% of the entire state total. So kudos to UWEC. The mean number of stipends per prep program that participates is 140. What we see in the data when we look at where are the prep programs placing which districts, we see fairly well-established patterns of partnerships that prep programs are generally placing their student teacher under the Rural Teacher Talent Grant in a small subset of rural schools. Often, not always, but often these are rural fringe districts. They're located closer to the prep programs. So there's some access issues that are related to, again, back to this theme of distance from prep programs. That's from the prep program side, looking at participation from the prep program side. From the district side, this is a little bit of what we see. 247 different districts. That includes about 93% of all of the rural districts in the state have hosted at least one student teacher under this stipend program since the program started. Now you may say, wait a minute, isn't that higher than the number of rural districts? And the answer is yes. There is a little technicality in you don't have to teach in a rural district, you have to teach in a rural school. There are some non-rural there are districts that are not rural that have one or more rural schools. So you can get this stipend if you student teach. It doesn't have to be a rural district, it has to be a rural school. So that's the reason for the mismatch there. The district range in terms of number of stipends, a lot of districts have hosted just one, as many as 244 over time, and the mean number is 14. So we see on this map, here's a little a visual way of looking at this. The red, the different shades of red here are all the rural districts. The green, the neon green, those are rural districts that have never participated. So again, there's only about 7% of the rural districts in the state. We'd be interested in knowing what some of the issues are here. Again, because you can see it's large, it is a geographic issue, but that doesn't probably explain all of it. What you see in the red here, the shading is the intensity, the amount of the participation. So darker red is, I can't read, this is really small, that's between 1 and 5 total stipend recipients over time. And then when you get to the pinkish, those are the heavier users in terms of the districts. And what can you see? There's a cluster around Eau Claire. There's a cluster around some of the other prep programs. So that's what this looks like from a district standpoint. Couple of seeds to plant in terms of how we've been thinking about this. What does this mean for policy? One clear implication here is that, and we know this from some of the interviews and surveys that Jenny has been working on, awareness of this program among students seems pretty low. We have some evidence that about 80% of students, even the ones who are participating in Aspiring Educators, Educators Rising, students aren't aware of this. Prep programs, again, we have little over half of the state's prep programs. Some of them don't participate at all right? So there are opportunities to build awareness, we think. We're going to continue to learn from a student survey, people who participate as stipend recipients. What do they use it for? Does it change the way that they think about their potential career options, having student taught in a rural district? We want to continue to evaluate impact. I can share with you that we have some promising early stage evidence as relates to how many of these participants actually enter and then stay in teaching in rural schools. We have some promising evidence that we're going to write up in our paper for this summer. Here's a policy question to put on the table would be, would we ever think about expanding eligibility to town schools in addition to rural? Now, I would say that's probably not a great idea if the appropriation doesn't increase, because all we're doing then is diluting the size of the stipend. And of course, so we'd want to be careful about what we were thinking there. Another idea might be, could there be a different size of the stipend the further you were away from the prep program? So rather than the stipend amount being the same, maybe the stipend amount would be higher the further you, so for like a distant or a remote district. Something to think about. Okay, second program very quickly that we want to highlight. It's called the Wisconsin Improvement Program. This is a much older program. It's been around since the 1980s. This is not rural specific. Any district in the state can apply for this. So what is this program all about? It provides basically an alternative to traditional student teaching. It allows districts, they initiate the request, they can hire a pre-service teacher on what's called an intern license that DPI approves, that issues, to serve as teacher of record for up to half a day. So half a day they're teaching, half a day they're working with a cooperating supervising teacher. So it's just a little different spin on traditional student teaching in a way that I think is very consistent with some of the research that's coming out now around how do we make student teaching a more intensive experience, right? So you hear a lot about registered apprenticeships and things like that. This is sort of in that same space. The prep program provides documentation that someone working on an intern license is ready for that level of responsibility. And again, they work with a cooperating teacher. They are paid directly by the school district. So what are some things we've seen from, and thank you, by the way, thank you to DPI for this. They've been a really good partner in providing us with some important data, including intern license data. We see I'm just looking at about the last 10 years worth of data. That's about when DPI has comparable license data. There have been about 2,000 instances of intern licenses being issued. About a third of those have been to work in rural districts. So in essence, what that means is that when we compare this program to the Rural Teacher Talent Grant, there's less uptake among rural and town districts. And visually, it looks like this. So the gray districts are the town and rural districts who have never participated, who have never hosted an intern under the Wisconsin Improvement Program. And the red is, again, the intensity shading, where the lighter the shade is more student interns working in rural districts. So again, in contrast to the Rural Teacher Talent Grant, where you saw there was a lot more red on that map, a lot more gray here because there's just less uptake. About half of the rural districts in the state have ever participated in this program, compared to about 93% who have ever hosted a student teacher under the Rural Teacher Talent Grant. Okay, leave you with a couple of things in terms of what we're concluding about this program. We think this is a promising model. It, again, is consistent with some of the research that's coming out around how can we provide more intensive but still supervised and, key thing, and paid opportunities for pre-service teaching placements, again, similar to residencies and apprenticeships. On the other hand, we see that there's low awareness. Again, students are telling us, don't know about this program, didn't know it was an option. They're also, we see lower uptake rates in terms of districts. So we're interested in learning more about what are some of the barriers to participation from the perspective of prep programs, from districts, and then from pre-service teachers themselves. And we want to plant this question around what would it look like to make this program a more intentional and well-utilized strategy for rural districts to recruit and retain teachers. Okay, threw a lot at you there in the last set of however long we've been taking. Want to transition at this point to, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny, who's going to introduce our panel.
All right, so in our final note before we move to the panel discussion, I want to just reiterate the innovative strategies that districts, EPPs, and students are using to justify a teaching career despite the uphill battles, and even more so, those who choose to teach in rural districts. So our panelists today come from Wisconsin, Illinois, and Minnesota. These three states share borders, have reciprocity for teacher licensure, and in many cases provide teacher education to each other's college-age students who then return to their home states to teach. Therefore, these contexts are dependent and interrelated, but having somewhat different approaches to addressing staffing needs in rural school districts and beyond. So because of these similarities and differences, we hope to have a great conversation about how Wisconsin is moving the needle and what the state is invested in, while also asking our peer states for complementary practices. What are they doing? How is it playing out? And what is effective? So I'd like now to welcome our panelists to the stage for our exciting regional conversation on the rural teacher workforce. All right, well, I feel like camera two. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. I'm just going to start by asking if you can all just go down the line and say your name and your current role. And then also, well, let's do that first, and then we'll go to the first question.
Great, thank you. My mic on? Can you hear me?
Great.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Laura Mogelson, and I am from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, where I serve as the director of an office called the Multiple Pathways to Teaching. So it's where we run, I guess, what are considered higher ed-based alt prep. So I work a lot with provisionally licensed teachers. I also have a residency program, so kind of the clear opposite of that, and do a lot of para to teacher work with partner districts. And then I also serve as the registered lobbyist for our MACD, which is our Minnesota Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. So we have 23 member institutions, and I represent our interests at the Minnesota legislature and then annually at Washington Week with our AACTE, the American Association. So thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Jeff Wright. I'm currently the superintendent in the Sauk Prairie School District. I've been in the district for 14 years. I grew up in Stevens Point, and so when I look at that map over there, and I always wonder, like, when we went to college, people ask, well, what is Stevens Point? And some people would say it was a city. It's not. Some people would say, oh, it's not suburban because there's not another city next to it. Well, but it's not rural. Like, we look at the stoplights we have. So confusing when you look at that map on like what we actually qualify each of our communities as. After Stevens Point, I also served for 9 years as a high school principal on the south side of Chicago, and then made it to a small farm in Sauk County where I get to now work in Sauk Prairie.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Shaw. I'm the Deputy Research Director at the Wisconsin Policy Forum. If you're unfamiliar with our work, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit policy think tank. We cover government finance, economic and workforce development, and I have the pleasure of leading our education research portfolio. So statewide work that touches on a number of pieces that connect to the conversation today, and like Jenny, started as a high school Spanish teacher.
Hi everyone, my name is Shireen Oka-Beilstein. I'm a senior research specialist with the Illinois Workforce and Education Research Collaborative. We're a research unit within the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And the last two is related to recruiting and retaining the educator workforce in K-12 public schools and districts across the state. Some projects that we've done are related to educator shortages and retention of teachers broadly, and specifically I have a project with Jenny right now that looks at science and math teacher retention in rural districts. And we know Brad.
I guess you don't have to introduce yourself, Brad. Sorry. Okay, so glad to have this esteemed panel together with our conversation today. So for this first question, again, it's not going to be everybody answers the question down the line the whole time, I promise. And we'll also start with you, Shireen, this time. We'll work this way. But we'd like you just to provide a little perspective from your state and your position that you just shared. What's going on locally regarding the rural educator workforce development sort of broadly?
Yeah, great. I'd like to highlight kind of two projects that we've done related to educator shortages. So first, for several years, we've partnered with the Illinois State Board of Education and also the Illinois Association of Regional Superintendents of Schools, which is similar to, what's the name of the regional?
WASDA?
Yes.
Our CSAs?
CSAs.
Our
sorry.
regionals? Yeah.
Yes. In Illinois. And so both of those agencies conducted annual data collection efforts. The state board collected administrative data on unfilled educator positions from districts, and then the regional superintendents conducted an annual survey of district superintendents looking at perceptions of severity of shortages, as well as the impact that those unfilled positions had on day-to-day operations, on class offerings. And then also, for the past few years, iWork has collaborated with the state board to evaluate their teacher vacancy grant pilot program. And so this is a 3-year statewide policy initiative where additional state funding is provided to districts that have the highest numbers of unfilled teaching positions to use for recruitment and retention efforts. So a lot of the findings that I'm going to focus on today are primarily from those studies. So at a high level, what we're seeing is that teacher vacancies are pronounced in rural areas, and then within those communities, we're seeing concentration of unfilled teaching positions in special education and STEM. And this sort of mirrors what we're seeing in other states and across the country. And so this is a specific problem unique to rural communities because we're seeing that these vacancies are really at the interface of harder to staff subjects within harder to staff rural schools. Data that we found, though, show that the causes of teaching vacancies and the specific needs that these communities are sort of needing in terms of staffing and hiring are localized and nuanced. But like at a finer grain within the rural districts, the needs of one rural district differs from the needs of another. So for the teacher vacancy grant, for example, there are some districts who are really sort of recruitment oriented. And so they devoted grant funding to improving school culture, to enhancing professional learning opportunities, to upgrading school facilities. There were other rural districts that really focused on recruitment. There were some districts who I talked to who had a special education vacancy that they were carrying over from year to year and they couldn't fill it. And so some of these districts turned toward strategies like hiring bonuses, for example, to sort of target those specific unfilled positions, investing in current staff to pursue certification or licensure in those specific positions, and sort of across the board in terms of workforce development, rural districts tended to cite the same factors for issues in recruitment and retention. They cited lack of qualified applicants, fewer resources, and lower salaries. And as in the presentation before was highlighted, rural educators are in unique settings where often they wear multiple hats, and they may have to teach in subjects outside their content areas, which can create a different type of workload and lead to burnout. So we saw that rural districts also sort of cited that as main areas of cause and concern.
I'm thinking about this question from two major angles. The first being the workforce itself. So in Wisconsin, some of our research has looked at this workforce, not to the same degree of depth that Jenny and Brad have looked at it, but statewide, we track teacher turnover quite a bit, in addition to principal and superintendent turnover. I know we're talking largely about teachers here, but that whole ecosystem is in play. If you have high principal turnover, high superintendent turnover, that's creating an unstable system that educators are working in as well. And one major theme for me as we look at teacher turnover, principal turnover, superintendent turnover, and use of emergency licenses is that we did not look so much at the different types of rural in the sense of remote versus distant versus fringe, but rather the size of districts. So on most metrics, our rural districts are in slightly worse shape than the state average when it comes to these different levels of turnover or when it comes to use of emergency licenses. If we narrow that down to look at small districts, which we defined as those that serve fewer than 500 students, most often sometimes like 455 and below, our small districts, which are overwhelmingly also rural districts, are seeing some of the highest levels of all of these factors. So in keeping with the theme of not all of our rural districts are the same, it's really the smallest districts that are seeing very high teacher turnover, that are seeing very high principal turnover relative to the state average, and are seeing the highest uses of emergency licenses. None of these unto themselves maybe would be terrible. Sometimes turnover happens for good reasons, but the degree to which we see it happening and so consistently really paints a statewide picture, or I should say from the statewide vantage point, without getting to talk to these districts individually and learn more about their stories, really indicates something happening, an instability here that is probably creating some cycles of instability that once you get caught in it are difficult to break. So that's one major theme for me, thinking about that kind of cycle of instability and specifically what's happening in our smallest districts. The other is thinking about the overall financial picture here, and Brad already spoke to the fact that we have in Wisconsin overall declining student enrollment. The majority of our school districts are in a declining enrollment state. That starts to put financial pressure on districts very quickly because the amount by which their funding is decreasing on a per pupil basis, or I should say the total funding decreasing, is not happening at the same pace that they can adjust. And so we're getting to a very painful point for districts and in many cases for local taxpayers of how to adjust in a way that can protect the student experience and also keep that relationship between districts and communities whole. So the educator workforce piece comes into play here, both in terms of things like talent recruitment and retention. What are you able to pay your teachers? What are the working conditions for those teachers? But also even thinking about what are staffing levels at all. I think there's a conversation to be had here about how many teachers should we have in Wisconsin. But the path between where we are now and where we probably need to be is not a smooth one, and probably going to be quite painful for districts, communities, and staff, and hopefully less so for students. But that's an undercurrent here for me as we're talking about the educator workforce. It can't be divorced from the overall economic context that our districts are in.
I could talk about the GROW collaborative, but
Well-
I don't do that sort of research. That's their expertise.
Yeah, I think it was more like just, I mean, from your role as a superintendent, just sort of generally speaking, you don't have to go into depth about anything yet, but just what is your perception of the educator workforce challenge?
Well, it is different for every one of us. And to kind of to emphasize Sarah's point about how many small districts we have, I think out of the 421, 300 have fewer than 1,000 students. So you just picture how many of our districts are serving maybe one section of first graders or maybe two sections of fourth graders, and how hard it is to find the ideal candidate to be the science teacher at the middle school. And you talk about the need for emergency licensure if you're teaching every one of the science classes at a high school. That's a really challenging job. And do people sign up for that sort of job when you're going to be teaching every single elective and required science class in that sort of environment? So it doesn't surprise me to hear that sort of pressure. We're about 2,700 students, and so we find that we are attracting teachers from other districts with about 9.5 years of experience on average. And in part, it's because they can't wait to only teach chemistry or to only have these two responsibilities as opposed to every single responsibility. And because the DPI research and some of the things that you've done, Sarah, point out how quickly, like, people come into the profession and leave after maybe 3, 4, or 5 years. If you're lucky enough to be able to recruit somebody with 9 years of experience, they know the work and they're likely to stay in it. So that being just that much more adjacent to some of the other communities of size in these educator preparation programs does change the sort of work for a district like mine with 2,700 students than my colleagues with whom I speak at much smaller districts, that it is a really, really difficult job to fill when you're considering the number of responsibilities we put on a teacher in a small school, and we also hope that they're going to help with the extracurricular load because so much of that makes school fun and attractive and brings the community back into our schools all the time and therefore more supportive of them.
Just a minute, Laura. I just want to point out to you, Jeff, that's, I think, a really important point here is that so when you're thinking about the hiring of a teacher into those positions, is that they're actually, responsible for, all the kids who want to go into STEM, careers for the entire, length of their high school career. And so something like that intense responsibility, is something that should be uplifted, but not something that somebody is just sort of like tossed into.
Yeah.
And that can be sort of very tricky, I think, for teachers.
In addition to your 4 or 5 preps.
Yes, exactly.
Good point. So in Minnesota, about half of our districts are considered rural, and we have many teacher preparation providers, and so it's less a problem of recruitment. I'm going to base some of my data or some of my comments based on data from our Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board. Every other year they present a report. We also, and I'm sure our friends up here also have a retention problem. And I think it connects to some of the challenges that our rural teachers also face. And we also have significant investments in the teacher preparation, workforce development that I'll get into later that have really grown exponentially over the past 10 years and have quite an interesting history in Minnesota. We have 36% of teachers in Minnesota, and this is from our state licensing board's report. So 36% that hold the full professional license, which is transferable. It's not a limited license. It can go to other states that accept it, or anywhere in the state. 36% of people who hold a current license are not teaching as teachers of record in Minnesota. So that's a pretty significant number. And 31% of new teachers exit the Minnesota workforce within the first 5 years of teaching. So there's clearly a bleed happening where we're not retaining our teachers that we have invested in preparing. And then we have provisional licenses we call Tier 1 and Tier 2, and those are district-based, and there's very limited ways you can qualify, and they have certain time limits associated with them. And the highest concentrations of those you are finding in the rural areas, and they're specifically around special education, as you can all imagine. That is probably, across the whole country, the hardest to fill. Also world languages and career and tech ed. So those are the three that we're seeing. And so we've had some really significant impact in making investments to solve this problem around the retention problem and on the shortage issue, which I'll get into later. So thanks.
Thank you. So I just want to make 2 points, and then we can move into a conversation on Grow Your Own. The first is, we were talking about regional as in across 3 states, right? But I think also to Jeff's point earlier, I think we should be thinking regional about how districts work together, and also, your smaller rural districts and your larger rural districts, your town districts and your small districts, right? Your city districts and your non-city districts. And so I think it's really important to sort of reframe how we often think about the teacher workforce challenge, which is that it's linear and it's this teacher and this program and this pathway, into this school, right? Because teachers do sometimes move around, right? Teachers do sometimes exit the field. But what if there's a way, instead of it being a competitive environment, that it's a cooperative environment? So that's going to be a softball into this Grow Your Own conversation. And then the other point I want to make, and Shireen, this is kind of in relation to some of the work that you've done at iWork, which is it's also important to understand how we talk about data when it's related to rural districts, which Brad has also pointed to. And I think iWork has done some really interesting studies where you can talk about the number of teacher vacancies per district, and you can talk about the percentage of teacher vacancies per district. And I just recall, and you can talk about this a little more, but that if you look at the numbers, well then in Illinois, Chicago just sucks the air out of the room, right? In terms of how many open positions they might have. But when you start looking at the percentage of teachers that are needed, then you're looking at all of the smaller districts, and you're seeing these incredible, gaps in what they need to offer. At 20% of their teachers are turning over. That is a huge difference than if but if you count it number-wise, it might be 4 teachers. Right. So I don't know if you want to say anything to that before we kind of keep going here.
As a person who was a high school principal in Chicago and now in rural Wisconsin, you're completely right. The impact on missing 3 teachers in Ithaca is very different potentially than even 300 teachers in Chicago, and what we're asking those individuals to do. So I just appreciate how you're looking at the data in a more complex way than we have maybe in the past.
Yeah. All right, so we'll go ahead and turn to talking a little bit about Grow Your Own programs. So we'll begin here with Jeff. I would like you just to talk as a district that's participated in the Grow Initiative. What's going on locally in terms of how does this look? How did it come about? And how is it being sustained?
I'll give you a little bit about what it is. You saw the grow with the plant coming out of it on the screen earlier. That wasn't, so our original vision was that we would create a collaboration across many districts that had way more in common than apart from each other, both geographically and the cultures of our schools. And it surprised us that we had several districts that just turned us down, that we right now don't have an extra dollar to spend on growing our own, so we're not going to sign up for this application to the state of Wisconsin to receive some grant funding to do this. And so in the end, it became Lodi, which is just kind of northwest of Madison, Sauk Prairie, and then Cambridge, which is now on the other side of Madison, and Wisconsin Heights, which is directly west of Madison. We're not contiguous, all of us. our goal was that we would be contiguous and kind of wrapping the south and west side of Greater Madison in these rural communities, and that we would identify areas where we had needs for teachers in the future, and that collectively we hoped that our graduates would fill those jobs in the future, 5-6 years out. And how we were going to do this is to give them a small scholarship when they left high school if they promised to at least look into teaching, hoping that that would be their path. The scholarship would go up once they entered into an official teacher program at their university or began taking education classes. And then it reached its largest amount at $10,000 to help pay for the semester when they're student teaching. And the promise that they made to us in return is that if you're going to accept these dollars, you need to apply for the open teaching positions that align with your field in these 4 districts, or at the time we hoped like 8 districts. If you don't get the job, the money is still yours. We're not going to claw that back if there isn't a job open or if you don't get selected. But that's part of that promise, is that you are going to consider coming to one of these 4 districts in return. It started in part because of a grant available through the Department of Workforce Development and the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation called a Workforce Innovation Grant. And that became the seed money to start this program, because we knew we needed enough money to actually fund those $10,000 scholarships. But then each district contributed about the same amount that we were spending out in the first few years to create a sustainable account. And so if we spent $50,000 to $60,000 in the first year on scholarships, the 4 districts put in about that same amount into this collective fund, so that when the grant would run out, we knew that there was money for this to be sustained over time. We've now reached the point where we have lived out past the grant, and so one of the questions that we're also asking is this a great opportunity now for us to go and say, it's worked? I mean, I have several of my teachers who graduated from our high school. We helped fund their student teaching and now are returning to our workforce as members of our team. Can we now go to some of those adjacent districts that said no in the first round and explain this is the actual cost, and here's the proof that we've been able to welcome some of our own graduates home as teachers. Do you want to come in and help share this cost in the future? So that's the simple program. I will tell you that unfortunately we have not, I mean, this is good news, bad news. The programs from which they've graduated and with which degrees or certifications have not always aligned with what we needed, as only 4 districts. We're the big district of those 4, and we're not that gigantic. And so we have had people graduate like a business teaching degree that one of us thought we were going to have, and now that person is teaching somewhere else. Great that they're still teaching. But the idea was that we were growing our own and investing in our own, and we did invest in our own, but in the end they didn't come home, partly because we didn't have a job available. So that's a basic introduction to the program. 4 districts, it has been a success, and I'm proud that we have a few of those teachers from the GROW program now working in Sauk Prairie. I wish that there was a way that we could have partnered with more across the state, or that the state had resources for us to do this too. But I do want to honor that when the state saw this as an opportunity to invest in an innovative program, that we did receive one of those grants, and without that grant money to kick this off, I don't think it would have been possible.
Jeff, just one more question.
Yeah.
Just with your unique positioning at a district, I'm really curious, what is ultimately the value of having somebody who's from your community or from your neighboring communities come back and teach? Like, what does that mean from the superintendent's perspective?
Well, I've been there long enough, so it's fun to watch them like be students and now coming back and teaching our students. So it's partly, I know that it's an emotional connection to the district, and that they know what it's like to live here, and hopefully if they make the choice to come back, that they might stay. So it's certainly that. But it doesn't need to be a Sauk Prairie grad. If we can get a Lodi or Wisconsin Heights or Cambridge grad to consider our program and our school district first, and know that they have to apply because of the financial arrangement, that maybe we get some teachers to apply for some of the unique positions that we have struggled to fill in the past. If you apply for this and you have an interest in special education, you pretty much know you're going to get the scholarship. Ag, languages, some of the ones that we've already identified today. So I think not only do we want you to come home and teach in a community that you know what it's like here, you're likely to stay, but also you're helping us meet needs that we are able to identify in advance. We are hoping that it also helps us diversify our workforce. As you saw in the data that Brad shared earlier, that 83% of students in rural and township districts in Wisconsin are white. I think that there are many people who are surprised that our rural communities are becoming as diverse as they are. If we can make sure that the students who are receiving these scholarships reflect the graduates coming out of our high schools, that's going to help us diversify our workforce in the long term too.
Quick follow-up for you, Jeff. I know there's been, when I've talked to, and Vince Brunig, superintendent of Lodi, he was going to be on our panel. Vince had knee surgery. He didn't time that out very well, didn't clear that with us, but he was going to be on our panel today. But so when we've talked about this in the past, we've talked a little bit about this issue that you raised. What's the sweet spot in terms of the number of rural districts? Because you have this challenge of, you come out with the business ed degree, and in one of these 4 districts, you may only have 4 business ed teachers total. And if you didn't time that out such that it was, it's hard to time this out. So do you have a sense, and okay, so one question is around, you reached out to some of your neighbors. Do you have some thoughts on, what would be the ideal number of districts that would be, and I guess it kind of depends on the type of licensure, right? Any sense of that? Maybe 4 was not enough?
I don't think 4 was enough, but I think it's also just your total student population.
Yep.
My assumption is that my teammates in Lodi Heights and Cambridge don't want any more Sauk Prairies in the mix because we're just that much larger, and so it's easier for us potentially, the economies of scale, to have a better insurance package or have a lighter teaching load but based on number of preps. And so I wish that we had Baraboo, River Valley, some of the districts that are contiguous to us that are also a little bit larger. And I think that would create enough jobs every year to be able to meet you don't want to invest that much in a student and not be able to say yes when they want to work for you. And so maybe almost doubling the size of the consortium if we could.
And just one quick follow-up on that. In the world of budgeting is very much a here and now process. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, did you have conversations with other districts around, hey, this would require some kind of investment up front, but there will theoretically be some savings because we know something about what does it cost to replace teachers. Mm-hmm. And depending on who, the Learning Policy Institute has a good paper out on this and has done some work on this, saying, depending on whether you're a small district or medium or large, the cost of replacing a teacher, it's not like that's free, right? You have costs for recruiting and hiring and induction and mentoring, and those estimates are anywhere between $12,000 or $20,000. The problem for budgeting is those are costs that you get later on, whereas if you're going to invest in this, I need to carve out money in my budget right now to invest. So any sense of how to make that case more effectively? One opportunity might be a state-funded program that we're going to hear about from our neighbors.
Yeah, convincing a school board that I want you to put aside $25,000 today, and I promise it's going to pay off 5 or 6 years from now. Yeah. When you're also deciding what programs to cut or what staff members to cut, I can see why that's a real challenge. Ideally, we would have found philanthropic dollars or other dollars to help fund this program if they were not available through the state. It's also a challenge whenever you're literally giving a $10,000 scholarship to one student from public dollars. And that is your district willing to take the risk of giving a scholarship to one student that you're hoping will come back and work for you? You can see that not all of the adjacent districts were able to sell that concept to a school board, that your school district fund should be used to grow a workforce that you don't yet know if you need, or if you know if they'll actually come back and work for you. The clawback was important for many of our boards, that if you don't actually apply or you decide to work elsewhere or you don't teach at all, that over a period of years you have to repay the grant. I think that was one of the things that made the deal in some of our districts.
They do have that?
In our agreement, when they sign for that $10,000 for student teaching, if they don't apply within our 4 districts, they do have to pay back the $10,000 grant.
Application being the key. They don't necessarily.
They do not have to necessarily get the job, and if we don't have a job for which they can apply based on certification, they're obviously forgiven that burden of paying it back.
So I'm wondering Laura, if you can talk a little bit about the Grow Your Own programs that you're aware of in Minnesota, and sort of thinking along all these different lines, but we're talking about philanthropic dollars, around state dollars, sort of the investment in these programs. And so what's happening in Minnesota?
Yes, thank you. So about 10 years ago, we started investing in this grow your own model from the state legislature. And it started off as an earmark from the legislature for two specific districts, the large urban districts of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then two preparation providers. And it was based on the year-long teacher residency model. And so those programs had been going for a few years, and every year I was involved in them, in working in them from the university side. Every year we had different funders and different funding structures, and never really knew if we were going to be able to run year to year, which made recruitment very challenging. And then we got this earmark from the legislature, which enabled us for 2 consecutive years, which felt very relaxing, to be able to fund the program. It provided money for us to be able to pay tuition and a living stipend, and then the districts also paid insurance. That lasted for a couple of years, and then very, very rapidly there was interest across the whole state in being able to participate and get funding too. And it shifted from being this earmark to then being a competitive grant program, and they put a little bit more money in there. So it went from 1.5 million to 6 million. And then it also became competitive. So the earmark went away, and then the districts that had been getting the funding had to compete. And so it turned, and it's still competitive now 10 years later. And at the same time, it also, I think of it as a pie, where previously, we each got half of a pie. Then the pie was cut into much, much smaller pieces, and the whole program shifted to 2 different pathways. There was this adult pathway that was similar to the Minneapolis and St. Paul one. Then they also added a youth pathway, and so it's analogous to the Wisconsin program that Brad shared about, the teacher club. And so it was supposed to fund all of that. And as you can imagine, that $6 million got sucked up very, very quickly. And then a couple of years after that, there was a real push in Minnesota to deal with the diversity of our teacher workforce and the real lack of teachers of color and American Indian teachers in Minnesota. And so a very powerful coalition came together and really honed in on the Grow Your Own money, and were able to lobby the legislature to completely shift the focus of that program away from being a competitive grant program for providers and districts, but to one that is focused on teacher diversity specifically, and shifted it to be that 80% of the funding had to be specifically spent on future teachers of color or American Indian teachers or teacher clubs that served students of that demographic. And that is a very noble cause, but it had a real impact on our rural Minnesota districts, who were no longer able to meet that criteria because of their demographics and their communities. And so, and the 6 million pie, it turned into a $35 million pie. So it's grown exponentially. It's sitting at about 25 million now. But what has now happened over the years is they've been unable to award all of that money. So there's $18 million that's just sitting in a special revenue fund. And now there's new legislation out of the session this year where they're hoping to shift that 18 million out of Grow Your Own, where it has the demographic restrictions, into a special ed Grow Your Own. And so to help address our special ed teacher shortage, and then specifically also address rural access. Somewhere in that timeline, there was also a stipulation put into place that to the greatest extent practicable, the Department of Education is supposed to distribute the funding equally between rural and urban. And I think they're trying their best to do that, but this $18 million that's just sitting there, I think, is proof that it's a challenge. So that's the sort of short answer to that, the Grow Your Own work. And there's a lot of really great things that are happening in rural Minnesota around Grow Your Own, like you've talked about with districts coming together, and our state highly encourages that. That's been powerful. So rural districts forming consortiums similar to yours. What we don't have right now is district level investment to that level. It's really reliant upon these competitive grants. Luckily, they're 5-year grants, which is really helpful for recruitment and building up interest. That was a shift that happened about 4 years ago. So, thanks.
Wow, there's so much in there, Laura. But I think what I'm hearing, sort of from both of your comments is really the need for sustainability, right? And so the initial seed money from the states is very, very helpful, right? It gets energy behind these different programs. It gets folks interested and committed, and then what? So I'm hoping, Shireen, you can maybe talk a little bit about some of the models that they're utilizing in Illinois.
Yeah, so in 2005, a initiative called the Grow Your Own Teacher Education Act passed. And since then, the state has been devoting funding to the Grow Your Own program. Different agencies have since administered. The Illinois State Board of Education administered for a while, and now it's funded through the Illinois Board of Higher Education. And so how the program is structured is Grow Your Own Illinois serves, I believe, 7 different areas. And so I'm just going to talk about some common features related to the Grow Your Own regions in rural adjacent and rural facing areas. And so each consortium is led by a teacher preparation program, a 4-year higher ed institution, and some of the consortia also partner with a 2-year higher education institutions. The preparation of foci differ, and I imagine this happens through talks with the relationships that the higher ed institutions develop with the regional offices and the districts. And so in some regions, the focus is really on growing like early childhood educators or special educators. Another region is really focused on building elementary education teachers. But the network among the consortia are pretty consistent, consisting of regional offices and school districts in partnership. And the supports really touch upon the supports that Jenny mentioned earlier, providing financial aid to candidates and wraparound services such as like laptop loans, childcare support, maybe some stipends for books and supplies.
Yeah, thank you, Shireen. I think, the Grow Your Own Illinois has, as you mentioned, been around for quite a while. And it's in the state legislature to put money behind the programming. And then that's getting funneled through this other organization that's managing the funds and making sure that they can deliver on the impact. And so I think, again, this is just another model that maybe we can think about in Wisconsin. Like, what does it mean to really put this into legislation and then move it forward in such a way that we are able to identify what is impact, right? How long are these teachers in these positions? How many are coming out? I think that's potentially a really interesting model to learn from in Wisconsin. But I'm also curious, there's another set of programs that I remember hearing about. So Shireen and I work on a project in rural Illinois looking at STEM teachers and the retention of STEM teachers in rural schools. And so part of that study, what we're learning is that there are also, again, regional, like rural districts that are coming together with a higher ed partner to address this challenge on their own. And so the Southern Illinois Future Teachers Coalition is the one that I'm aware of. And I think they serve something like, it's 20 districts, I think, that are all like collaborating together, but it's more on that high school pathway. But this one, I think, is also funded through, again, initially a grant in CTE And so I don't know if there's anything that you have to share about that, or just maybe even some thoughts on CTE funding as a pathway for teachers, if that's something that you could share on.
Yeah. So we're seeing the state devoting funding to the preparation of future educators from starting as early as high school. The program is called CTE Educator Pathway Grant Program, and so that's the sort of overseeing program for the SIFTC. And this grant program has been in effect since 2020. And so it identifies or provides priority to districts that meet certain criteria. You only need to meet one. One of them is in a rural area. Another one is related to state funding. Another one is having a high teacher vacancy rate. So here they use a vacancy rate as opposed to number of unfilled positions. And also thinking about building our educator workforce in terms of the proportion of students that districts serve from diverse racial or ethnic backgrounds. And so the state overall has invested, I believe, $10 million into that CTE Educator Career Program since 2020. And for the SIFTC, I believe they received a 4-year grant for around $250,000 to devote to building out those pathways and CTE courses between schools and higher ed institutions.
So this is, again, I think an interesting idea, because we're seeing at the federal level interest in apprenticeships through the Department of Labor. We're also hearing a lot from rural districts around, how do we think about apprenticeships, which are in a lot of ways very similar to grow your own programs. And so I think, the idea that CTE and thinking about teaching not just as a profession, but as a career pathway, one that we can invest in long term and start with apprenticeships, is another interesting sort of opportunity, in terms of creating and expanding the rural educator workforce. So I think then, Sarah, I do want to bring you in here from like your 10,000 foot vantage point, in terms of, thoughts on, I don't know how, you already started this commentary, I think, but how investing, like how rural districts can think about investing their dollars to support these types of programs, along with investment from the state, like in terms of investing in other areas, right? Because they only have a certain amount of money and they have to make decisions. So I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about that from your research.
Yeah, I think the starting point there is knowing that the majority of a school district's budget is staffing. So when we talk about per pupil costs, or when we talk about the per pupil revenue coming in, what we're talking about is how much money is available, not as a general kind of amorphous raining down of dollars. That would be nice. These are what are the dollars that you're using to pay your people, and people are education's greatest resource. So when we talk about the money, I think it's easy to divorce that from the people involved, and really it's one and the same. So a few thoughts there. First of all, there is this kind of broader conversation about just what is the school funding landscape in Wisconsin right now. And the forum will have a piece coming out hopefully later this week, maybe next week, depending on how our review process goes, that's looking at the results of last week's election, where we saw a number of school referenda on the ballots. And this is a move that's been in the works. We've had declining approval rates on referenda since 2018, and more interest in reducing property taxes. So there's been a kind of statewide discussion amongst taxpayers. There's also a statewide policy discussion around how much do we emphasize tax breaks versus investing in K-12 education. The forum does not take position one way or the other on it, and just is putting out there that we have seen that dedicated policy push that has resulted in a lower tax burden for Wisconsin over time, and has resulted in less funding relative to the rest of the country. So our ranking nationally in terms of how much we spend per pupil has been declining at the same time that the percentage of a taxpayer's income that goes towards state and local taxes has been declining. That stands to reason because the largest thing that state funding funds is K-12 education. So you can't affect the taxes that are coming in without also having an impact on education. All of that to say that we have diminishing investment, not on a raw dollar basis, but in this kind of proportion compared to the rest of the country, at the same time that we have student population declining, that is putting a lot of pressure on districts and putting a lot of pressure on taxpayers. And how a district is positioning itself to, at the local level, make sense of all of these trends for themselves and for their taxpayers is a real challenge. I think part of why we still see referendum passage rates that are over 50%, and that's kind of incredible if you think about it, that in this most recent election where just over 60% of referenda got approved, 60% of property taxpayers saying, yes, take more money from me, I want to fund my public schools. But that percentage has been declining. And so this conversation around, I'm going to bring it back to not just my TED Talks, but this conversation around our educator workforce is so tied up in more macro level questions of what are we asking of our communities, what is the case that we're making to our communities, and how can we be thinking, I love the invitation to be thinking more collaboratively rather than competitively, because those turnover rates are, for rural districts and small districts in particular, mostly when we talk about turnover, because we have such a high exit rate in the first few years of teaching, it's not a teacher jumping from one district to another. It's a teacher leaving the teaching profession. So that's number one of like, what are we thinking about when we think of retention? However, for our smallest districts, again, the subset of typically rural, they also have very high move rates. So it's not just losing a lot of teachers out of the profession entirely, the way it is for every other district. It's losing a lot of teachers out of the profession, and it's losing a lot of teachers to other districts. And so there is a unique challenge here for our smallest districts that as they're thinking about the funding situation, they're getting hit from multiple sides here and trying to figure out how to operate in a way that makes it a happy place for people to work and want to stay. It's very difficult to navigate.
You know, I have to say, I feel like what we're kind of like spinning around with like all of these comments too is the cost-benefit analysis of investing in new teachers, right? And so thinking about and for these rural schools, as we mentioned already, what is the cost of having a substitute teacher who tries their hardest, but a substitute teacher in the high school, you know, algebra classroom for several years because you don't have a full-time math teacher that's certified. Right? What is the actual cost of that for a community's students, but also for the community at large? You know, so there's the like a qualitative version of cost-benefit analysis that you know, that needs to be kind of played out in each of these communities in order to think about where that investment should take place.
Can I share a creative program we're piloting in Minnesota about? It ties to the conversation about staffing. And this has to do with residency and apprenticeships. And we did get another earmark a couple of years ago to fund residency and apprenticeships specifically from our Department of Education. And then, of course, there's federal Department of Labor and Industry dollars that flow to states that then states can decide how they use and distribute to all registered apprenticeship programs. The University of Minnesota system-wide is piloting an apprenticeship program, partnering with rural districts, where we're looking for, it's specific to special education, for paraprofessionals that have a 2-year degree minimum and are a paraprofessional employed by the district. Then they enroll in this online apprenticeship program to finish their Bachelor's of Science degree and get a teaching license in K-12 special education through the apprenticeship model using these state residency and apprenticeship dollars. And then the district is still employing them during this 2-year period as a para, but shifting their role from year 1 to year 2 as they grow in responsibility and become more like a student teacher. And there's certain restrictions around, you know, what that can look like in certain districts and depending on the situation that they're working in. But I think it's a really promising approach, and it's been something that the university has been able to partner with Warroad, Minnesota, in the furthest northern corner on the border of Canada, where they have, you know, maybe they have one person, but we can allow participation because we have collaboration across multiple districts, and it's an online program.
That's great.
If I could just, so I know that that proposal has come up in the Wisconsin legislature, and it, at this point hasn't made it through. And I think that what we have is a debate in the state over what do we wish the ideal certified teacher would look like and be prepared by, and then what is the reality for many of the rural districts we're describing. And that there are some people that are offended by the idea of this shortcut to licensure for a paraprofessional who's already on a district team. And what I would challenge is that then your district doesn't have to participate or doesn't have to hire somebody who went through that program. But if you are in a district where you have somebody who'd be willing to take this pathway, and it would allow you your first licensed special ed teacher potentially in several years, do we provide that option for the districts who need it? And I get the tension between, yes, ideally, everyone would go through a traditional educator preparation program, have a really great internship or student teaching experience, and then go into the profession and stay there for years. But we know too many districts that they just cannot find that candidate. Or they find that candidate, as Sarah pointed out, and 2 years later, they move to another district. And so I think that that's, I wish we would have a really frank conversation as a state that if our ultimate goal is making sure that every student across the state has access to a licensed teacher, does it matter if different districts use different tools and different options that are more flexible to get to that goal, knowing that it is really so much more easy to recruit a teacher to Verona, just off where Epic is located, right off the Beltline, than it is in a lot of that map. And so using some of the creative options that other states have used, even if it in some ways shatters some of our perceptions historically of how teachers are supposed to be licensed, I do think we have to look at that as a state, especially for our rural partners.
I'll add one other piece onto that if I can, which is that I think there's a tendency to want to speak of the teacher shortage as this monolithic thing. Laura was pointing out the specific areas of shortage in Minnesota that tie quite closely to what we're experiencing in Wisconsin. And the risk of talking about a teacher shortage at large is that you invest in growing and retaining teachers without thinking about where they're going and where they're needed. And in fact, part of what we saw in the federal pandemic aid when that came through is there were a lot of positions that opened up of districts that were hoping to attract more people to be able to serve student need and to put these dollars to use. That's also when we saw some of the highest move rates of teachers between districts because they could now go to a district that might be more attractive to them because the position had opened up. That is fantastic for that teacher. It exacerbated many of the difficulties that we already saw in our hardest to fill positions at our hardest to fill schools and districts. So a policy that isn't taking into account where we need teachers, both in terms of geography and in terms of the students served and the subjects taught, is just as likely to make the situation worse as it is to make the situation better.
Okay, great conversation around this first bucket, the first topic around what are the role of, what are Grow Your Own programs, what specifically has been the role of the state in helping support these. We're going to transition next to our second topic area that we raised, which is this idea of paid opportunities for pre-service teaching. And I'm going to start, Shireen, this time with you. Can you tell us a little bit about anything in Illinois going on in this space that that's worth us paying attention to?
Well, there was an attempt in Illinois to pass legislation that would require student teaching stipends of up to $10,000 per semester. It did not pass.
That was going to be paid for with state funding.
With state funding administered through the Higher Board Education, Illinois Board of Higher Ed. It didn't pass. So that was kind of what was going on in terms of the policy. Through the teacher vacancy grant, one of the things we analyze are districts' budget details and sort of how they spend their money, how much they spend their money. And several of the districts, about 17%, did devote money to paying student teachers as a way to, attract student teachers to their district, to sort of see what the communities are like. And the range of student teacher stipends that these districts paid, it was pretty wide, but on average, I would say about student teacher stipends for a semester was about $8,000. And there was one district who I interviewed who found this to be a very productive program for their student teachers. It wasn't a rural district, it's Rockford, but what they did was they paired their student teaching stipend with also a housing stipend. And so student teachers got to go to Rockford, teach, earn a salary, and their housing was also paid for and set up. Utilities were involved, so it was a little bit of an easier transition for students from other parts of the state to go and experience that area. They also kind of coupled that with student loan forgiveness stipends, so that if the student teachers came back to teach in Rockford and committed to teaching there for a certain amount of years, they would receive a student loan stipend of like, I think it was $1,000 or $2,000. So they kind of created this series of strategies to encourage student teachers to come see the area, get to know the community, and hopefully come back.
And this latter example, this was locally funded the effort to do this at the state level did not pass, and so what you're referring to were local examples? Did I get that right?
Yes, yeah, it was a local example. However, the Rockford, the district who created this sort of series of strategies to recruit educators to the area, they were using the teacher vacancy funds, which is
Gotcha.
a statewide policy initiative.
Okay, so it was state level dollars that were used specifically for this purpose. Gotcha.
Right,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Laura, anything? I mean, I know a little bit, tiny little bit about that Minnesota has a student teacher grant program. Anything in Minnesota you want to highlight in this space around paid pre-service teaching?
Yeah, thank you. So we have a student teacher grant program that runs through our Office of Higher Education. And it's up to the individual teacher candidate to apply to the Minnesota agency, the Office of Higher Ed. And then there's an attestation piece that comes from the provider. And then that money flows to the institution of higher education and then goes to their account. And so that has been overall pretty successful in getting money into the hands of our student teachers. It's for their final student teaching 12 to 16 weeks, depending on their license area. And there's been distribution across the urban and rural Minnesota. We call it greater Minnesota. Rural and urban areas in Minnesota. One thing we have found that it's often impacted by the success of the institutions in terms of advertising this opportunity for their student teachers and really encouraging them to apply for that funding in order to get it. One hiccup around that funding has been around it being something called the last dollar, a last dollar scholarship, and so it can sometimes negatively impact a student's overall financial aid package and reduce other loans and scholarships because it's flowing to the university versus coming as a payment or a paycheck from a district. So that's just an interesting problem to solve, and I don't think that it's unsolvable. I think we just need to solve it. Mm-hmm. And then we piloted last biennium a paid student teacher program that went to 7 specific teacher prep providers. And so where it wasn't a competitive program and reliant upon individual teacher candidates applying and the money eventually runs out, and if you miss the deadline, it's too late, sorry. This one, it went to like University of Minnesota Duluth or Augsburg University, and they had to report how many student teachers did they anticipate, and then out of this pot of money, they got enough stipends to pay, their 80 student teachers $7,500. Everybody just got it. There was no process for the candidate to have to follow, and that's great. I mean, if we could have universal paid student teaching for every single student teacher, and there was a nice seamless mechanism that didn't affect their financial aid, that would be a dream. Again, that one did have that potential effect. There was one institution that found a way around it, and it was the way in which they were able to apply that funding that didn't affect financial aid. So we're definitely looking at that. The range of the stipends for the student teachers, in the one that they have to apply for individually, that's $7,500. The one that was just given to the providers, that one ranged because they had to estimate their numbers. So it sounds a little bit like the one that was shared here. You know, it went between, I think it was between 8 and 10,000 that the teacher candidates got.
Okay. Jeff, maybe from your perspective as a superintendent, obviously, so you're a town distant district, so the Rural School Teacher Talent Grant is not something your district can utilize. Do you have any thoughts on a couple of questions? You have had interns working in Sauk Prairie.
Correct.
Can you talk about what's been your experience as a superintendent around what's the benefit to the district, and even probably haven't had very many teachers working as interns? What's the benefit of this program from the district perspective, and what's been the Sauk Prairie experience here?
Our experience and the benefit of the intern program was to utilize it to seek teachers for really hard to fill positions. And so one of the positions that we knew we needed to fill was an agricultural science teacher that would be both at the middle school and the high school. So split position, ag science. So we reached out to the universities and found someone that we viewed as an ideal candidate for the teaching position long term. This young man hadn't yet gone through student teaching. And so working with his university, we brought him on as an intern and told him in advance, if you have a successful first semester when we're paying you as an intern with a partner teacher and only half time, that partway through the year we'll be able to offer you a full-time position in this job. And what was great is that the teammates around him, one of our wood shop advanced manufacturing teachers, built a rock climbing wall in his aunt's barn. And so he started creating a relationship with other teachers and going rock climbing in the barn after school. And so I don't know if this person would have ever considered Sauk Prairie as a place to live or to teach or even knew where we were. But because we were able to connect to the university, invite him to do an internship, so a paid version of student teaching instead of a volunteer or paid, you're paying to student teach, that we were able to welcome him to the community. He started to like the kids, he liked his colleagues, and this is now he's finishing up his second year in the district. It was the beginning of last school year that we did this internship program. We did the same thing with an art teacher job, and that worked really well for us. We have offered the position for special education, but we have not been able to find somebody to accept that offer yet. So that's how we've decided to utilize it, is in hard to fill positions with an idea that if we get you into the district, if we get you into the community, we might just be able to keep you here because we know that there's a job coming open. So let's recruit a student teacher to come and spend time in our district and with our students and see if we can get them to stay.
With your intern program, we have something called a Tier 2 license in Minnesota, which is a provisional license. You either have to have a master's in the content or you're enrolled in teacher prep. Then you are the teacher of record. So you're not really an intern, although you're assigned a cooperating teacher, you're assigned a university supervisor, but you're the teacher of record. And the program I run at the university takes 2 years, and they're teaching while they're learning, and then eventually they earn their license. In the intern program, up on the slide, it said that for half the day they can be the teacher of record, and half the day they're a student teacher. Is it planned out, or do they? Is it just kind of like, oh, we need a sub, and they're subbing?
In our case, it was very planned out. Like I could have told you exactly what classes Jeremiah was teaching and when his university could come and observe him teaching and when they could see him with a collaborating teacher, just like it would have been in a more traditional student teaching role. And so we also do have some emergency licensure paths in Wisconsin that would allow for kind of what you're describing. I have a bachelor's degree, I have some experience in this. I'm enrolled in a program, and so I'm allowed to continue to teach while I get my full license. This is student teaching where half the day the person was independent, half the day the person was working with a collaborating teacher, and the district was paying, in this case his name is Jeremiah, we were paying Jeremiah for being part of our team.
And our interns, can they be undergraduates or post-baccalaureate students, or do they always have a degree first?
my understanding is that, so there are experts in the room that could answer this, but they have to be eligible to be student teaching through an educator preparation
So it could be
program.
undergrad.
Yep.
Correct. These, all of ours have been undergrad.
I also have another, we're going to do, I promise we have time for audience Q&A too. But my question for you too, Jeff, is it sounds like the district put a lot of effort into like talking to the ed prep programs, finding this particular student in each of these examples that you gave. That's a lot of, that's just a lot of work on the part of the district. So I'm just curious, is that like, is that always the way it is, or is there like another way for you to find somebody?
If there's another way, please let me know. No, I think it does require us to identify this, and you also have to apply through the Department of Public Instruction by certain deadlines to even get permission to do this, which adds another layer of like our staff time and our leadership time have to be dedicated to make sure that we thought we identified the perfect student, and for a while we didn't have DPI's permission, and we thought there's no way that our own state agency is somehow going to be in the way of us getting an ag science teacher, which if we don't have, at some point ag science goes away in a heavily ag community. So it was worth the time, and I hope he stays. So he's at least staying next year, I know that much.
Okay, Jeff, any thoughts on, this idea of, so the Rural School Teacher Talent Grant, explicitly, intentionally rural, any thoughts on if that were to be expanded to where town districts were eligible for that? Thoughts on how we think about the trade-offs? My own view on that, I think, would be, makes sense, but if the appropriation stays the same, then again, what we've done then is just watered down the amount of the stipend, therefore decreasing the probability that this serves as an incentive to encourage someone to do student teaching in a rural district. But is this an example of something that, would Sauk Prairie be interested in something like that if the rules of the game changed?
I think my official answer is always supposed to be, if Sauk Prairie could take advantage of something, the answer is yes. But I actually don't feel that way internally. I agree with you that if we're just dividing the same amount of dollars over more districts, we're not solving the problem. I think that studying that map is fascinating, and that most of our urban areas are surrounded by suburban, town, and rural, all adjacent. And so that's almost hard to understand how you go one way from Wausau, you're going suburban, you go one way you're rural, and one way you're town, but they're all equally distanced from, or adjacent to Wausau, and therefore adjacent to the higher ed opportunities. If the UW-Stevens Point has a program within Wausau that's teacher prep, I don't know the answer to that. You would know the answer to that. So maybe we have to make it more a formula based on distance from the educator preparation programs, and that's where the dollar amount expands as a way to truly incentivize student teachers to leave the concentrations of universities and go further away, and not just to go to the right color on the map.
The ones that are geographically easiest in some sense?
Yeah, Sauk Prairie would be geographically easier to get to from some of the educator preparation programs than many of my township peers around the state.
Yeah.
But there are also rural districts closer to Madison on that map than Sauk Prairie.
For sure.
That's somewhat hard to understand.
Let's see, time-wise, I think, should we transition here? Should we maybe do...
Maybe that's a question for Sarah. You have one more question for Sarah.
Oh, of course, okay, yes. All right, so we talked about Rural School Teacher Talent Grant and the Wisconsin Intern Program, examples of state strategies to address teacher workforce challenges. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about the research that based on the research the forum has done on school funding? You've talked about this a little bit before, what are some of what we know about rural districts' economic stability and how it impacts their ability to compete in an increasingly competitive market for teachers?
Yeah, I'm going to mostly say things that I've said before, so I'll try to keep it short, and we'll just take it as reinforcing those key points. I think this teacher mobility piece really comes into play here, that for our smallest districts, being able to not only retain teachers in the profession, but also retain them in the district as opposed to moving to other districts is a particular challenge. And when the cost of replacing a teacher might be, call it $11,000 as a rough estimate, that can add up very quickly over time if you're essentially training teachers in your district to then go elsewhere and teach. So there is a real funding question here on the part of districts. And we do see strains showing across the state, and particularly in our rural districts, in part because there are just fewer levers to pull. When you have more staff, you can figure out what to do with more staff. When you are already fairly bare bones, you've got the one teacher per grade level or the one teacher per subject area, and stretched out across a large distance, where I was talking with the superintendent last week who said, I already have kids on a bus for 2 hours a day. There's just not much more he can do to do anything on the transportation front or say consolidation front. We think of consolidation as the answer if we have all of these small outposts, but that tends to make more sense these days in the places that haven't yet needed to be stretched that thin, which might be more like, I live in the outskirts of Milwaukee. I cannot tell you why there are 2 elementary school districts that are across the railroad tracks from each other. That is a historical artifact more than it is an expression of need. In our rural communities, there has already been a lot of paring down, and I think it's a very legitimate question of how much more can be pared down. And if that's the case, then we need more innovative solutions, whether that's thinking about regional cooperation through locally grown consortium and such, or more state level policy that asks questions like, if we're in a declining enrollment state, what does it look like to manage that decline in a responsible way that is recognizing that we can't just lose K-12 education in a whole portion of the state. If we cannot, how do we keep it in a way that is financially sustainable and also is providing students with a quality experience? I do not know the answer to that question. I don't know that we have found answers to that question, but it's inspiring to me to hear this conversation around the creativity at work locally, and fun to think of what might that mean then statewide to support such efforts.
Okay.
Yep.
Can we give our panel a round of applause here? We're going to transition.
I got it, Brad.
We're going to transition here to.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
I just want to make sure before, as we do this transition, I know there's a microphone somewhere. So we do have audience questions at this point. But I do want to just say that I hope that 2 of the takeaways that everybody's getting from this panel too is, number 1, that there are a lot of efforts that are in play, right? There's a lot of investment in trying to solve this challenge, both to the teacher workforce shortage in general and also to specifically and for and with rural school districts. The difficult part is that it's disjointed, right? The difficult part is that we have certain people working on this over here and this over here and this over here. And so where is that streamlining, right? Where is that cohesive program that we can all get behind? Maybe that's something at the state level, maybe that's something that's more regional, but I think that's a big takeaway. And Brad, the second takeaway?
The second takeaway, yes. The second takeaway, yes. I was just thinking about that. You caught me thinking ahead to questions. So what we've seen here, I think, when we look across what we've learned so far, is that what we have in Wisconsin compared to what a couple of our neighboring states have, we don't have anything that's maybe quite as rural specific, other than potentially our Rural School Teacher Talent Grant. We do have that. We don't have as much, I think. We have pieces in place, but what we're moving toward gradually and need to move more quickly toward is a more coherent and well-aligned system of different pieces here. We have parts of it, but we're still, I think, progressing toward what that might look like and what would be the role of the state in helping to support that.
Thank you. All right, you've been burning with questions, I know. I saw at least one over here. Can I get that microphone though, please? I don't know where it went. Okay, great. Please use the microphone for accessibility purposes. That would be really helpful. So, thank you. You can direct it to somebody or just ask, whatever you'd like.
Okay, this goes back to the beginning of the presentation, I guess mainly for Brad. I wasn't clear, what are the parameters you use to differentiate between fringe, remote, and distant? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. The answer is those are all done by the National Center for Education Statistics. I could have put the website for how the determinations are based on proximity to urbanized areas. They basically put schools and districts into categories that say average of more than X miles from urbanized area. So that's the primary factor. It's not a calculation we do. It's done by the National Center for Education Statistics. They do update those every few years, so there are some interesting scenarios where a rural fringe district becomes a rural distant district. And since the district itself didn't physically move, you might ask a good question like, how does that work? And I don't have a good answer for that. Actually, maybe one of my colleagues knows. Grant, I'm going to call on you here.
Sure. So to answer your question, fringe is between less than 5 miles away from urban. Distance is between 5 and 25 miles, and remote is more than 25 miles. Thank you. And then in terms of reclassification, there are NCES updates these like zones which are based on addresses of schools, and they are updated after census updates. So recently all the codes just changed based on the 2020 census updates. So that explains why some schools will shift boundaries into different locales, and then districts' locales are assigned by like a weighted average of all the schools in the district.
Okay, another question, I believe.
Hi, this is a question for you, Shereen. I was just wondering if you had talked about the state not supporting a stipend program for student teaching, but then a district stepping in. But could you talk a little bit more about the state funding that it sounds like from what you said, they had taken grant funding from the state and used that grant funding to kind of do what the state decided not to do.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if those were programs that came to be at the same time, they were both on the table, or if that caused any issues with moving the plan forward.
Great question, and sorry for the confusion around that. So in 25, there was legislation to mandate the state to provide student teacher stipends, which didn't pass. However, aside from that, there was a teacher vacancy grant, which is a statewide policy initiative that started in school year 24. And so this provides districts with flexible funding to put toward recruitment and retention efforts. These districts are also the districts that have the highest numbers of unfilled teaching positions. And so that's kind of the unique component of this grant, right? I think Sarah mentioned that teaching vacancies are really unevenly distributed, and so I think the state recognized that need and wanted to see what would happen if we direct funding to districts, gave them some autonomy, though the state did provide oversight, on how they sort of allocate that funding to various recruitment and retention strategies. Would that result in changes in those vacancies that they see, those specific ones being filled? And so those districts who are participating in that program, some of them allocated some of that specific funding from the teacher vacancy grant to paying student teachers to address recruitment issues in their area. Does that clarify? Okay.
Minnesota's Grow Your Own funding, which is separate from our student teacher grants, can also be used by districts to pay student teaching stipends, along with tuition, books, transportation. It's quite flexible, that funding.
This flexible funding seems like an important mechanism too. I feel like we hear that across the states in like certain buckets as like the way to provide funds that then the districts or the EPPs can use to fill the need as they see it.
To do that, we would need to have good data on where there are vacancy rates, or what the vacancy rate is, or what the percent of unfilled positions is, which is
That's something we can learn from Illinois.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did as part of evaluating the teacher vacancy grant was to understand how districts used available data, both like internally at the school and district level, and then publicly available state data, to figure out where to target their efforts. And the state board does do an annual collection of unfilled positions. They survey districts, ask them which unfilled positions across a variety of educator roles, from teaching to administration to school support personnel, how many vacancies they have at the beginning of the year, and then that data become available roughly around March in the following year.
Quick follow-up on that.
For that school year, though.
Quick follow-up on that point. In Wisconsin, we have tried a couple of times to do district hiring surveys to try to get a sense of what are we trying to get our arms around in terms of unfilled positions. One of the challenges is incomplete response rates on the survey means incomplete set of information on vacancies. Would I be correct in thinking districts in Illinois have an incentive to fill out the survey because it's tied potentially to teacher vacancy grants? I mean, how do you get good information across the entire, because we have 400 districts, you have 800 or something like that, right? How do you get good information when you really want to get everybody to respond to tell you about that?
That is a great question. So in school year 23, the state sort of did a different type of data collection where they encouraged all the districts to respond, and I think they got roughly 95 to 98% response rate on the unfilled positions data collection. Previous to that, they weren't quite sure in the data, if you're looking at it, whether a district has a blank, whether the district didn't respond, or whether there was a zero. And so they kind of refined their data collection efforts, and we got some really nice clean data from pretty much most of the districts across the state on their unfilled teaching positions. At the time, the teacher vacancy grant had not been announced, and so what happened was inclusion into the teacher vacancy grant was based on that school year 23 data, but the actual funding for the grants and the grant announcement and sort of program participation started after those data were collected and reported.
Hi, Rob Meyer of North University of Chicago and UW-Madison. So we haven't talked about a topic that I'm wondering how you think about it, and whether there's any policy levers. The issue of the two-career family. One person teaches, the other one doesn't. How do you attract and retain that family to the community when one's a teacher and one needs some other kinds of job? What do you do?
That's a great question, Rob, and Sarah, I'm going to look at you on this one maybe, but I think there's what this brings up for rural districts is that it's not just about having a school that has an open position that you can try to fill. It's also about the economic viability of the community and the kinds of potential jobs that community, or if it's a bedroom community, right? If you can drive somewhere and expand the number of potential jobs. So I think that two-career question, I think to me really gets at how the school contributes to economic growth in a small town, but it can't be the only economic growth in a small town. So yeah, so Sarah, I don't know if you know, or Jeff, if any of that rings true for you.
I think the piece I would add to that, Jenny, is whether that pressure is a little bit less when we have had more remote work options come in. However, that then needs to be bolstered by equitable distribution of Wi-Fi. And so the interconnection between all of these different infrastructural pieces, whether it's schools, whether it's other job centers around, whether it's the overall economic vitality or literal can people get connected. So on the one hand, maybe there's actually more flexibility here than there has been in the past. On the other hand, it's actually a different frontier of digital equity when we think of, do all of our urban students have access and families have access, because they often don't, or at least not actively. And that is also a rural issue. So it's a case where we can kind of get advocates involved in spaces that might look very different but actually lead to the same conclusion.
My 2 cents is that the school district leadership job has changed to be one more that's much largely focused on the community's needs, and not just what's happening in K-12 education. And so in addition to an additional job for a spouse, childcare, housing, you kind of go down this list of what makes a community livable. And if you have to drive a half hour away from that community in order to find regulated, licensed quality childcare that you can afford, at what point do you decide just to move your family to that place instead? And maybe that other spouse continues to commute the half hour back to teach in that community, but then at some point maybe decides we're giving up that community completely. So in our district, and Sarah's written about this a little bit, we opened a 168 child care center run by the school district. And across the street from that, we negotiated a land sale. And the apartments, for the next 15 years, the apartment rent rates are tied to first-year teacher salaries. Because we know that if we can't find a place for people to live and where their children can be cared for prior to school age, that we are losing families to the entire community. And in the end, if we're going to be fighting this enrollment battle, because enrollment equals dollars, as Sarah continues to remind us, I need those families to choose to stay in the community. Otherwise, in the end, I'm not going to have enough students in my graduating class to warrant the number of programs that we hope to have for the kids in high school.
Jeff, that's such an important point to remember too, that if the community is thriving, the school is thriving. And if the school is thriving, the community is thriving. These are not like differential scenarios, right? They have to be thriving together.
It is often the number one reason a family chooses to live in one community over another is their confidence in the schools.
This strikes me too as a good example of this theme we've been building on, that not all rural districts are in the same position at all in terms of this proximity to a career for a non-teacher. So for example, Jeff, in Sauk Prairie, you may have a family, a couple moves in, one's a teacher and one's not. There's a reasonable number of non-teaching jobs within fairly close proximity to Sauk Prairie in a way that is not true when you go to further outlying areas of the state. For the spouse who's not the teacher, you're more constrained. Now, as Sarah points out, that can be somewhat offset by remote work, but only if there's good internet. And we know we've invested a ton in that, and it's a little uneven.
And UW-Madison's Dr. Stephen Deller talks a lot about the commuter shed, like how much further we're willing to commute, especially if you only need to go into work 2 days a week as opposed to 5 days a week. You're willing to live much, much further away from that office. And so this actually is to the benefit of rural communities in the state, because now you can consider living in Richland Center and driving to Madison for a job. And while you wouldn't have done that 5 days a week, making that hour-long trip 2 days a week, or only when expected by your employer, doesn't seem nearly as irrational. If that's a community where you want to have your kids raised, or you want to be on a farm, or you have one of those relationships where somebody's working in the Ithaca School District and somebody else wants to continue to make the trip into Madison, but doesn't have to do that nearly as often as they would have pre-pandemic, when the expectation was 5 days of in-person work for most jobs every week.
I just had a quick question. You guys presented on paid student teaching, which I think is an admirable thing to do. But one thing I'm concerned about at working at the university is the cooperating teachers. So in Minnesota, I don't know, Illinois, I assume you pay or provide a stipend for your cooperating teachers. And we have no such structure in Wisconsin to do that. And so whether it be internship, a regular student teaching, a parapro program, so on and so forth, the cooperating teacher, the mentor teacher, is actually the leverage point that is more likely to predict whether that person to be successful, whether they're going to stay in the district, and so on and so forth. And without that funding stream, and you guys didn't bring it up, and I think that's a gap a little bit in the literature and the research here, is that we know it's effective, and have you guys considered that and how we might do that going forward?
It's a very good point. At my there's no legislative funding that is particularly aimed at supporting the cooperating teacher or the mentor, and they are vitally important in this environment. My university, we pay our cooperating teachers regardless of the length of the experience. So it could be 12 weeks or 32 weeks. They get $599, and it's just based on not having to then issue a tax form for them. And some districts have, they have specifically, in our affiliation agreements with them, mandated rates, and it's like $25 a week, $40 a week. I mean, it's really just nothing. And so I think that is a huge problem that you're naming, that we're working very hard on one half of the problem, which is paying the student teacher, but the role of the mentor and the cooperating teacher is so important. And I think that there's a lot of interest from we have a very strong union in our state, and they've lobbied for paying honorable wage for that role, but it's not been sustained, and it's a big gap.
Just to say really quickly about that in Illinois, through the teacher vacancy grant, I did see that there were districts who previously were unable to provide any sort of monetary compensation to cooperating mentor teachers. But in tandem with the districts that made efforts to provide compensation for student teaching, I also saw that they did provide either like a stipend or an hourly stipend to cooperating teachers as well to try and sort of build out those programs in their schools.
Oh, one more addition, the pilot program I mentioned that we're doing around apprenticeships, that one does provide for a much better stipend for the cooperating teacher that in that case is called a journey worker, and so which is much more appropriate to the work that we're asking them to do, and it's significantly more than the $5.99, but that's not writ large.
I'll also just make an anecdotal comment. So when I was teaching back in Ohio, they actually, and for better or worse, right, it tied instead the mentoring, cooperating, because I was a cooperating teacher, to continuing education credits.
We do too.
So another, obviously more money in a pocket is one, method, but another was eventually having some sort of payout and return on the investment, because it takes a lot out of a cooperating teacher, but it's also like a really enjoyable opportunity to like kind of, support the next generation of teachers. So I think there might be some more, again, creative, flexible ideas that we maybe can come up with for that challenge. Thank you for bringing that up. Other questions?
Brad and Jenny, thank you so much for your hard work and continuing to advocate for rural schools in our state. Thank you, panel, for what you are bringing to this discussion too. This is an excellent summit. So not to bring politics into this, but what are some practical ways we can encourage and grow bipartisan support for funding paid student teaching and internship programs from our current huge state budget surplus?
I feel like I always have to preface discussion of the surplus by saying it is a current positive fund balance that, based on current state budget, we are already projected to spend down. So there's a lot of money available right now, and a lot of it is spoken for in the long term. It doesn't mean that we don't still have opportunities now, but I think that's an important point to just kind of have on the table. There's a lot of discussion, as many people in this room know right now, around having it be a debate between, do we lower property taxes further because there were such spikes on these December 2025 bills, or do we put more money into K-12? Something of a false dichotomy, because if you put more funding into K-12, then K-12 doesn't have to rely on property taxes as much to fund. So there's that discussion. There's the discussion of childcare, which I had a quick fix in the last budget and arguably needs much more sustained funding in order to help kind of repair a fairly broken economic system. Those are big ticket items where I think it's harder for a niche topic like this to kind of make inroads. But part of what's really appealing to me about when we talk about rural issues is that by definition is bipartisan. I mean, if we look at kind of who is representing our rural areas, that is not restricted to one party or another. And being able to hear from district leaders, from community members around what do they want their schools to look like and feel like and have opportunities available to students. I am not in the political game. No one should take my political advice. The forum should not be involved in that in the first place. But I think there is some leeway there for really thinking about coalition building and just clear communication around what the stakes are. When every district is saying we need more money, that is a powerful message, but it's also different districts are in very different states. And I think a representative who is hearing a district say, I need more money because I want to do X, Y, Z more, versus a district that's saying, I need more money because otherwise I cannot operate. These are different stories that if we combine them together, it makes for a singular message of we need more. It does not necessarily give the full validity to the the straits that some of our districts find themselves in right now.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I think that is actually all we have time for today. So I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us for this lovely event and this conversation on the rural teacher workforce. And also thanks again to the Thompson Center for funding this event and for continuing to invest in research around this topic. Thank you so much, everybody.